Hi there, welcome to part 3 of a special Roqe Series assessing the Pahlavi Dynasty, 40 years after the death of the last Shah of Iran. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. This is a 3-part series based on interviews conducted in 2020. On the 40th anniversary year of the death of the Shah, we wanted to use the occasion to take stock, if you will, of where we are at in understanding the history of Iran in the last century, the place of the Pahlavi Dynasty, and the precipitants of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. We assembled a group of 3 well-known thinkers who have all deeply studied the Pahlavi era and have differing opinions on the legacy of Mohammad Reza Shah 4 decades after his death in exile. In part 1 of the series, we heard from Dr. Abbas Milani. In part 2, we got a perspective from writer and historian Andrew Scott Cooper, and in this part 3 of the series, we hear from renowned Iranian historian and author Mohammad Amini. I should note that this is a special Roqe series. For our regular episodes of Roqe, we invite you to visit our website, roqemedia.com, where you can find all of our editions of the program, the guests we've had on, and our ongoing mission to build an audiovisual encyclopedia of Iranian diaspora identity. You can also help us out there if you like what you hear on this program and become a patron of our show by pressing the Support Us button at the top of the website. Okay, let's get to part 3 of this series. So on our last edition, we heard from Andrew Scott Cooper, who has written what may be called perhaps a generous appraisal of the Pahlavi dynasty in the final years. But as the late Shah's record is one of the most contentious and divisive subjects of contemporary Iranian history, it should come as no surprise that Andrew Scott Cooper's account has generated strong pushback by other historians. This episode's guest is one of those critics. Prominent Iranian historian Mohammad Amini has done extensive research on the 1953 coup and is the son of a close confidant of the late Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Professor Amini began his political life as a supporter of Shapur Bakhtiar, the last prime minister of Imperial Iran, but he is famed for his historical research on subjects varied from modernity to constitutional revolution to tribal and ethnic discourses in Iran, the last Islamic movement, and the formation of a nation-state in Iran. Mohammad Amini is a prolific author whose books include Tradesmanship with History, a factual investigation into the 1953 coup aimed at debunking the misinformation campaign against Mossadegh, and The Time and Life of Ahmad Kasravi. Mohammad Amini joined us from Orange County, California. Hello, sir.
Thank you very much. I just have to make one correction. I'm not a professor. I don't teach anywhere, so I appreciate that, but I just have to make sure that people don't don't make that mistake. Thank you very much.
I appreciate the correction. I think I project professorship onto all historians. So can I call you a historian?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Before we get into some of this, I mean, you would be among that flight of intellectuals who left Iran during or after 1979. And as I say, before we get into the debated historic questions, give us some background, some context about your personal experience in those volatile months before and after the revolution, and what created the conditions for you to leave Iran for the last time.
Well, I, just like Dr. Milani, I came from a background of activities in the United States in the student movement against the Shah, and very idealist at the time. Everybody was idealist at the time. I went to Iran a year before revolution, and I witnessed everything, and it was amazing. And I was involved in a lot of things, and I stayed there survived there actually for 4 years. And the biggest issue that I confronted at the time that I was in Iran before revolution was when Bakhtiar was selected by the Shah to be the prime minister, and the Jabhat Milli the National Front was against that. And my father was very, important in that relationship and had spent a lot of times in jail with Bakhtiyar. And when Bakhtiyar came to power, it was pretty much too late. It was a movement that had gone from the point of possible reform to the point of no return. And it was a very, very sad situation for a person like me to see Iran collapse into the hands of the Islamic, fundamentalists and people that have no clue even to how to turn the television, into the for themselves. So yes, it was a sad situation. Basically, I watched, very close by, the collapse of all at least the superficial elements of modernity in Iran, and everything else that was created.
Right.
And under the banner of Marg bar Shah, down live United States and all of that, Iran actually going to a very, very wrong direction. And that was the biggest issue at the time.
When you say, like Dr. Milani, you returned to Iran for a time in the mid-'70s, you were also, like him, pro-revolution, or at least sympathetic to it before things turned and it was co-opted by the Islamic formalists. Would that be correct?
Oh, absolutely. There's nobody at my age group of 18 to 24 that was not for a change, major change. Everybody was for that, but none of us were for this kind of, so-called revolution. We wanted a change. And I was like that too. I was a young kid. I liked it, the change. And then very soon I realized that this is a change. I'll tell you when I realized that. When I came from Isfahan to Tehran on the night that Tehran was burning, when Shah basically declared control in 12 cities. And that night when Tehran was burning, and I was looking at the people that were burning Tehran, I said, really? Are these the guys that you are going to leave the country to? So it just shook me. And after that, we realized that we are basically confronting a mob, and at the same time, a gorgeous movement of democracy and all of that, which had really limited leadership. So yes, there was a problem at position and opposition. If Shah had heard the voice of the revolution a year earlier, and the opposition had heard to that, if somebody like Bakhtiyar or Sadeghi or Sanjabi or somebody like that was put into power a year before, 2 years before, Reza Pahlavi would be king of Iran right now.
So just to clarify, when exactly did you end up leaving?
4 years after the revolution, after my kids were singing, and I mean the Arabic, so-called initial national anthem of Iran, I told my wife at the time, we gotta leave. And of course, I was in danger all the time, and because of my father's relationship with people that were known in the government, I was kind of safe, but at the same time, I didn't feel safe. So my kids and my wife at the time, they left from the mountains of Kurdistan, and I left from Mehrabad with a bribe. I never been back again.
Wow. So let me get into this, the historiography of what we can look at in terms of what happened 40 years ago from the prism of 2020. As more and more diplomatic communiques from the late 70s are declassified, a revisionist historical approach, it seems, is emerging with regard to the Iranian Revolution, and specifically regarding the record of the late Shah of Iran. And this new approach tends to challenge that conventional wisdom that overwhelmingly blames the late Shah for everything from being an authoritarian dictator to a weak puppet of Western powers and everything in between. Is now the time to redraw historic conclusions?
Yes, it is. Actually, it's the best time to do that because Iran is, in a sense, pregnant with future. I think Iran is going to change. Iran is going to change dramatically in the next few years. And because of the position of Iran, historically, geographically, economically, and the influence it has in the whole region. That change is going to change Middle East. So that review is very important. But let's go back and review. We have this long article by one of the most profound economic, ministers in at least in the last 70 years of Iran, Ali Naqi Ali Khani, in the introduction to Memoirs of Alam. He is the best. That is the best analysis from somebody who was from within the government, who was inside the government, who was responsible in building the economy. That he basically says that the Shah screwed it. He had the best economy, he had popularity, but his issue of selfishness, issue of dictatorship, concepts of him being it, really destroyed it for himself. Let me go back, if I may. After the coup of 1953, which I've written a lot about, and I hate the elites of the people around the Shah for that. But after that, at the beginning of the 40s, the Iranian 40s, the American 50s,
yes,
or 60s, I should say, Shah started reforms. And those reforms actually, along with the increase in the oil prices, were the biggest, most important reforms, social reforms in the Iranian history. About women, about land, just about everything. When we get to beginning of the 1970s, Shah is the most popular king. As a historian, I can tell you, from the time of Nasser-ad-Din Shah, which at the time the popularity was basically mandated, he was popular, he was accepted, and the opposition groups were absolutely non-existent. Jabhat Milli was nobody. The left was just an underground, few groups that had no influence. And this man could have changed the course of history, used his popularity with all the social reforms to political reforms. And if he had done that, his son would be the Shah of Iran right now. He didn't. And that is the biggest issue with the Shah, that he didn't use that popularity of reform, which made him an extremely popular individual at the end of the 40s, when he actually started the White Revolution and Inqilab Shah Millat and things like that.
Yes.
I still don't understand why not.
There's conflicting ideas around who he was and what he did. So I was just speaking with Andrew Scott Cooper, who makes the claim that the Shah was actually quite shy and modest and not the arrogant dictator that he's been made out to be. Do you think the way the Shah has been portrayed in personal terms has been unfair in the last 4 decades?
There's not enough information at hand to judge that, but there is a point to Professor Cooper about this. Shah was a very weak individual. You want to know about a person, you have to read the memoirs of the closest people to him. And one of the closest people to him, that to the end of life loved him, was Soraya. And in that phenomenal book, The House of Solitude, which is of course in French, written by a Frenchman with the help of Soraya, she mentioned so many points that the Shah is so lonely, so scared, that every time there's a problem, he actually packs his suitcase. He wants to go out. He wants to just leave. Basically, you get this impression that Mohammad Reza Shah was the second Shah after Ahmad, the first Ahmad Shah and then Mohammad Reza Shah, that they became reluctant Shahs, reluctant kings. During World War II, when Iran was invaded by Allied, Shah was a reluctant king. He was very scared at the beginning. gradually he discovered his power. And to the end, I don't think he was a bloodthirsty dictator. He was a very, very, not very confident individual to the end. And even to the point that Heiser comes to Iran and says, "Sir, you have to leave tomorrow." And he asks, in the morning or afternoon. There's a huge difference between his character and his father that was begging Furi to stay in Iran, even if he's not a Shah. So, yeah, he had basically issues with his character.
What about the notion that new evidence shows that, according to historians like Cooper, there were significantly less human rights violations, less abuses, less executions under the Shah in the 1970s than the world had been led to believe in the run-up to the end and the aftermath of the revolution? What is your take on that?
Oh, absolutely, that's true. You know, I met Shokrullah Paknejad, which, we called him Shokri, one of the longest prisoners. And he was critical of the activities of the groups of people that I belonged to, Milani belonged to. We were opposition, student opposition, young kids outside of Iran, which we exaggerated the number of Iranian prisoners to 100,000 and all of that. And he was saying, listen, at the high time of our arrest, we were only about 5,000 people in jail. Yes, there were torture, there were a lot of things. There's no question that there were abuse of power and use of human rights, but it was exaggerated. It was grossly exaggerated. My father went to jail 11 times, from the coup to the time he left Iran. And every time that he actually went to jail, the head of Savak or somebody in the Savak would call, and my father would pack his bag and then go to jail, and then stay for 10 days, 15 days, 3 months, 6 months, and come back. No scars. The opposition outside was successful in claiming that and establishing it and selling it, and then the Bernard Nasser Committee in London actually made it official, and once they said that, it was totally accepted. There was dictatorship, there was torture in Iran, there were political prisoners in Iran, but the amount of it, basically the level of it was exaggerated. There's no question about it.
Mohammed, could it be, as Abbas Milani suggested to me on Monday, that the different and often contradictory profiles of the late Shah, offered by different historians, may all have truth in them, truth to them, in the sense that the Shah may have demonstrated vastly different personality traits at different stages of his rule and at different stages of his life?
Absolutely. That goes without saying. You can say that about Reza Shah too. But then look at the life of the Queen of Iran, Shah Banu. I've never met her. I don't have any sympathy to her, but her closest friend was Hajibi, a major figure in the left who actually went to Cuba a few times with Hajibi, and Farah was sympathetic to him. And there were levels of freedom in Iran that nobody realized at the time, especially in the social area. Political, the man was crazy about it. He should have let that political freedom, thrive. He would not have been thrown out of, his rule. The issue is the society became so divided that when the Islamic extremists came and took over the whole revolution, there was nothing to stop them. Realistically speaking, yes, we could have lived a different way at the time. Well, that's for people that make movies.
But how do you explain why the Shah of Iran, who as you say, presided over tremendous reforms, modernity, was incredibly popular by the early 70s. why he didn't have better instincts for what the people would want and expect around the political suppression that happens throughout the 70s and into the late 70s that ultimately is one of the reasons for his downfall.
Just like any other dictator, they don't trust people around them. They think that they're doing these things in order to gain against them, instead of accepting things that people like Ali Khani were doing and other peoples within the cabinet were doing. Instead of taking advantage of that, he thought that these people are conspiring against him. That's a concept of dictatorship. Look at this. At the beginning of the rise of Reza Shah, every intellectual from Mashrute, from Constitutional Revolution, was around Reza Shah. At the end, everybody's gone. Some are dead, some are killed, some are in jail, some have escaped the country. The same thing happened to Mohammad Reza Shah. The problem with dictatorship is mistrust of the people that tell you the truth, rather than understanding that these people are telling you what to do. They go after exactly the same people that are telling you the truth, and dictator thinks that he knows the best. He can actually run the country without anybody. So at the end, Shah is a lonely guy. Nobody's around him to advise him.
Let me ask you about the revolution itself and your take on it. One other area that's receiving more scrutiny by researchers is the alleged connections between the revolutionaries, the mullahs, in fact, and foreign powers, primarily the United States and Britain, in the months leading up to the revolution. Based on your research, what do we know today that we didn't know even, say, 20 years ago?
There was a point that finally Western intelligence groups came to the conclusion that they cannot protect the Shah's government. They have to go to someone else. And the only thing they saw in the whole situation, that Iran had a very, very large, active leftist movement and 1,000 miles of border with then Soviet Union, the only choice they had was a Islamic movement, which they thought they would control the same way that British thought, they would control the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. But I think we should go back. I think that's not about just the last few months. The reality is that after the beginning of modernity, from Iranian Revolution of 1905, and then the rule of Reza Shah and everything else, we had development of two societies in Iran. The modern society of the cities and the so-called non-modern society of the villages. And with the increased income of oil, there were more and more reason for people from villages to come to cities. And it became a situation that probably on the verge, maybe 2 years before Iranian Revolution, many cities in Iran had become villagized, had become more and more ideologically close to ideology of villagers who came to basically make more money, and they were religious. And Tehran, most of the mosques, never had anybody more than 50 parishioners, and suddenly 1,000, 2,000, all of that. We had a revolution of people from outside of cities against the cities. And really, the cities were taken over by zealots and believers in religion, and that's really what happened. Everybody was just completely surprised. How is it possible that a city like Tehran, with all these beautiful boulevards and stores and everything else, bunch of religious zealots are taking over?
But back to in terms of the connections and the enabling by the United States, say, of those formalist Islamists. That would be related to a strategic play related to the Soviet Union?
Yeah, of course. They looked at the Soviet Union as the enemy, and they played that. But the problem with the policy of the United States at the time was that the United States was completely different from the several hundred years of the colonial rulers of England. England would study every country completely. I mean, they would just go over every inch of that country in order to be able to control, and they did for many, many hundred years. The United States basically, people sat in an office and analyzed, and many times never realized what's going on. Yes, the idea was to support any movement against the left and all of that in support of the, maybe they wouldn't call it Islamists, they thought this is just passing things. But to this day, I have to say, to this day, the United States doesn't have complete understanding of what happens in Middle East, in cultural, tribal, religious, and everything in that regard. And they lose every time. The reality is that there was a chance, huge chance for the United States to align themselves with the democratic forces in Iran and calm down the situation. They did not, because it was a global issue. So, yes, the United States definitely helped creation of the Islamic Republic without intention. This is not that they wanted to do this, but they had no choice. They thought Shah is gone. Who do we bring to power? And that's what they did, because every time it is like that, and I've always said that, in my speeches and researches, every time British Empire left a country, it was with a ceremony, with a flag, kind of brought down and respectfully left. And most of the time that unfortunately the United States left some of this country was either from a rooftop or absolutely in disgrace because of the lack of knowledge of the culture of these countries to this age.
At the center of all of this, back in 79, is General Robert Heiser's 79 mission to Tehran. And it's now widely known that Heiser met with senior Iranian military leaders without any clearance from the Shah and established meetings between them and Khomeini allies. Why didn't the Shah take any measures against Heiser?
Because he was afraid. Shah was not a very brave individual. He was not like his father. He basically thought that he is in a box, and this is a scripture they've given him to read. All the memoirs I read, interviews that I read from people that are very high in military, Shah never basically intervened. Shah was only interested in his cut, who he is he going to be there? Reza Shah wasn't like that. Reza Shah wanted everything, wanted control. I mean, you cannot be the half-baked dictator. Unless you're a dictator or not a dictator.
Right.
Shah was like, okay, whatever, I am there. And
but this is what Abbas Milani says, to paraphrase him, that he wasn't a dictator enough to prevent the revolution.
No, this is Darish Humayun told me this, a group of people like Darish Humayun got around the Shah and recommended that he would go and kill, like 2,000 people, arrest 20,000 and stop the whole thing. And he wouldn't do that. And to be honest with you, that is to his credit. That if there is one credit to the Shah is that he did not do that. He did not go in killing people and killing the whole so-called revolution by bloodshed and all of that. And because of that, that's a good point in his life. But that was not in his character anyway. And people like Dariush told me before his death, a good friend, wonderful person, we come from different from the opposition ideas, but he said, yeah, that there was recommendation was that go after the guys, kill, a few thousand people and arrest 20,000 people and put this whole thing to rest. And these people really believed that it's going to end it. And Shah did not fall for it. We can say it was because he was tarsu or not brave enough, or because that was not in his character, which is, in a sense, good.
Much of the narrative about the tumultuous final days of the Shah are based in two autobiographies, The Pride and the Fall, by Sir Anthony Parsons, who served as the British ambassador to Iran at the time of the revolution, and Mission to Iran, of course, by William Sullivan, the U.S. ambassador to Iran at the time. So today, historians such as Andrew Scott Cooper, we just heard from, raising serious doubts about the accuracy and the motives behind these autobiographies. What is your take on Sullivan and Parson and their books?
Very much based on their personal interest. It's not accurate. We need to gather more information from people at the time to come up with a more correct evaluation of what happened in the last 2 years of the last monarchy, because we owe it to the history. This is a country. This is our longest train of kingdom in the world, and it ended in a sense that nobody thought it would end like this. And I know a lot of people, or some people, think that it will come back, with Reza Pahlavi and all of that. Realistically, it will not go back. In no country it has come back. But I'm not talking about politics. I'm talking about the reality of history. This has to be evaluated, and both of the books you mentioned have shortcomings in that respect. And in final analysis, in my opinion, Shah of Iran, who was a dictator, who actually put the most decent man of the modern time of Iran, Dr. Mossadegh, in jail, he was a reformer. And he could have remained a reformer, and he would have remained despite all of these things as a reformer. He missed that chance. And so this is not a black and white evaluation. This is something that we have to evaluate. And the other last thing I have to say is that Shah was extremely suspicious of foreigners. He really thought many times, you see in the memoirs of Alam, Yadashtay Alam, that he says that these people brought my father to power and they took him out of the country, and they're going to do the same thing to me. He was extremely suspicious of that, and he was not powerful. To build a group of people around him that came from different backgrounds to fight that, and that feeling, the way he left the country on the tarmac crying. I was at the time a not Republican in the sense of American, but
right.
But when I saw the king of Iran crying like that, I felt ashamed for my country, for my people. It was like the Baymans that were forced on Iran to separate good portions of Iran from Iran. This was the king of Iran. And me and my father, as people that were absolutely for republic, seeing the king of Iran leave Iran in tears like that, to be honest with you, it broke my heart. Because that's my nation, and that guy, to that point, is my king.
A guy that you helped overthrow.
Yeah. But I didn't
You mentioned Mossadegh. And if you don't mind, let me ask you a couple of questions about 1953, because I know that's an area of your expertise. And Iranian intellectuals, such as yourself, have long argued that the revolution, in a sense, was inevitable, if long-standing, as a consequence of the 1953 coup. Just to push back on that, could it be that the coup was perhaps a defining factor only within the intellectual circles, many of whom were either nationalists or leftists? I mean, could the coup have had much less significance for the ordinary Iranian?
Yes, of course. I'm not one of those proponents of the idea that it was the coup that caused the Islamic Revolution. I don't believe in that at all. That was a terrible, terrible page in our history. It was the biggest mistake of the Shah, and I don't want to go into that. But the point is, it created a new chapter in Iran. The chapter that was opened in Iran after 1920, when the Allied forces invaded Iran, and there was some pseudo-democracy in Iran and elections and all of that, was that there could be political debate, and there was, and it was great. That ended in Bistash Mordad, ended in the coup. Mm-hmm. Now Shah had a choice. He ended it. He consolidated power. He now could basically build a new society. To some extent he did. And then to some extent he actually went further. He actually created some other issues, other problems, and problems that exist in the countries of Middle East. So the issue of the coup of 1953 has to be examined separately from Iranian Revolution. I know some people like to link the two together and say that's the cause. It's not the cause. Absolutely it's not the cause. Has nothing to do with each other. But yes, there is an issue that kind of democracy that has started in Iran after invasion of Iran by Allied forces, it ended in 1953. And nothing came back to it. And that is the biggest issue, that we never saw the signs of the constitutional revolution and the constitution, basically. Again, parliament became nothing. And Jin became, that's it, the ruler, which was the whole issue of the constitution to end. But that's the whole point. And there was a dialogue that was lost in the whole culture, in the society from in the 1960s actually, in Iran.
Just as a sidebar, the current regime, or the Islamist rulers of Tehran, let's say, they also rely heavily on the 1953 coup d'etat in their official accounts to delegitimize the Shah. This occurs to me as it's quite ironic, as they openly renounce the late Prime Minister Mossadegh and nationalists as well. So what is the root of this contradiction?
The root is basically a culture of anti-Americanism and anti-foreigner. That goes back to the middle of the 19th century Iran, from the Roqe contract, that Iranians actually rebelled against anything that was foreigner. And then after 1950, 1953, American became the enemy. They became the reason that Iran is the way it is. And the Shah became the symbol of the American control of Iran. And he was, as they call it, Nokara imperialism, Nokara America, things like that. That was it. Right. That American imperialism has taken over Iran so much that we have privilege. Shah became the agent of imperialism, agent of the West. And the mullahs used that tremendously, in a sense, capably, which the leftists could not do that. And the whole thing was a lie. Shah was not a servant of so-called imperialism. Yes, sure, he was aligned with the West. He was definitely aligned with the United States. But this whole concept that they told him what to do and he would do that, well, that was not true. But that wasn't an issue anymore. The issue was when the movement started 2 years before the Iranian Revolution. Shah was already agent of the United States. And U.S. was the reason that Iran was in this situation. To this day it is. To this day, U.S. the main enemy. And the Islamists actually use that, not just in Iran, in other countries too, masterfully. And the United States has not been able to respond to that. Realistically speaking, there were more friendliness between Iranians and Americans than animosity, but that was created and the government could not respond to that, and the opposition fell into that, and revolution fell into that. And realistically speaking, Iranian revolution became an anti-imperialist, anti-American movement, and we lost it.
I'm listening to you, and I'm cognizant of the fact that as lucid and logical and somewhat passionate as everything you say is, that there are people listening in our Iranian community that are going to jump on every line and disagree with it. And I want you to, I put this to Abbas Milani and to Andrew Scott Cooper as well. If you can take off your historian hat for a second and just talk to me as a member of the diaspora like myself. And the fact that there is so much partisanship, there is so much factionalism, a lot of it based in real emotion and anger and heartbreak about this period and our collective history. That when somebody, I can, in your case, for example, I can hear somebody saying, well, he's the son of a prominent ally of Mossadegh, so that's him. He's influenced by his father's teachings as well, and on all that. How do we mend this? How do we mend this instinct to jump into into different factions when it comes to assessing our own history?
I think we have to change the course or discourse. We can never unite on history. We're not supposed to. We cannot create a political movement, social movement, or any movement based on history, because history is history. And we're supposed to have different assessment of that. The Iranian intellectuals from all different backgrounds, they should start talking about the future. We have a country that at one time used to produce so much oil that was envy of every other country. We have a practically bankrupt country right now. We have an isolated country. We have very little relationship all over the world. So the point and the question among Iranian intellectuals, thinkers, people that are looking for the future of Iran is, how can we build this future? The issue is not Bistashta Mordad. The issue is not coup. The issue is not the analysis of what the Shah was, or Reza Shah was, or Mossadegh was. Those are extremely important as part of our heritage, as part of our history. But in building a new future, we have to start discussing how can we build Iran again.
Just returning to the precipitant for this conversation today, and for these conversations we've been having this week on the summer marking the 40th anniversary of the death of the Shah, if you can zoom out and going back to these narratives that played immediately, certainly before and after the revolution, about the Shah, about the Pahlavi Dynasty, is it fair to say, Mohammad Amini, after 40 years, the record of the last Shah of Iran has been rehabilitated to a certain extent in Iran's national discourse and the discourse of the diaspora, or at least significantly altered?
Only because of the things that the Islamic Republic has done. Otherwise, it would not have been. What happened, and we should not forget this. There are a lot of good things that were done under Pahlavis, both father and son. But the issue is that we had a revolution. We had one of the greatest non-violent revolutions in the world. And we created one of the first parliaments in the world outside of Europe. We passed laws. Democracy is not something that is built overnight. It takes time. I mean, you look at even the history of the United States or England, especially the United States. It came to a point that there was a civil war. 800,000 people died in that, and it took a lot of time. We were not given the chance of experimenting democracy and finding out how it works. And the most important part of the Iranian constitution was Majlis, the parliament. And Reza Shah called it a Tawil stable. And then Mohammad Reza Shah, basically after 1953, the coup, just absolutely put it aside. And he ruled basically as a king. Did they do some good things? Oh, no question about it. So my point is, no, the judgment about the Pahlavi Dynasty is not over. It has to be reevaluated. It has to be just. It has to be fair. It has to be balanced. And at the same time, it has to be judged against the possibilities of the time.
Right. Although, when you say any rehabilitation is based on what came after in terms of the Islamic regime, which many people now look at with disdain and despair, isn't that the point? I mean, isn't that people look back at their history and say, oh, we didn't realize what we had had? In fact, you hear some of this discourse in the United States now, where there's an upcoming election, and people will say they are reevaluating the Bush years now because of what we've had with Trump. I was an activist against Bush, but it is reframed now. And so this is the way we see the past, isn't it? Through the lens of what we are experiencing today?
In a very short time, yes. Yes. When you were looking at it in a very short time, yes. But when you are going to build a society for the future, no. You have to look at possibilities. I mean, when you look at the past against another past, and you say that this was the past and this was the other past, and which the other past was better than this past, then you are you're subjecting yourself to a limit. But societies are progressing. You don't have to do that. We are a proud nation with amazing underground and social geographic possibilities. So many different cultures. Why should we limit ourselves between the choice of this government and the last one? Why can't we say, why don't we build something new? You can use the same thing about this regime. You can look at this regime and say, they built 600 universities. They took, they brought gas to every village, electricity, all of that. But, they did this or that. The point is, our society is doomed to be within possibilities of the past and the past. Or they can look forward. I think we can look forward. We did it during Mashrute, during Mossadegh. We need to look forward. We need to look at possibilities that are real, that we as a nation, as people, with this history, with this culture, with this kind of abilities, so many intellectuals all over the world, we can build something a lot better than this society society that we're living in and the past.
So on that note, a final question, and you did allude to this earlier in the interview, but let me ask it directly. In recent protests in Iran, I'm thinking about last November, especially in those bloody protests,
Right.
we saw what seemed like a growing chorus of chants in the streets calling for the return of the monarchy. From the historic point of view, could a constitutional monarchy be some kind of natural successor to a theocratic dictatorship?
Without any bias, I don't think so. It hasn't ever happened. It has not happened in other parts of the world. And the problem is that we don't have the moral in Iran. We don't have a period in Iran that the constitution, the monarchy was abiding by the constitution, except during Ahmad Shah, which everybody called him such a weak, king, and promoted Reza Shah. I don't think so. And the bigger question I have is, why do we need it? I mean, is this a situation that our country needs a king to put the different parts of the society together? I mean, during this Islamic Republic, has any part of the country has separated? I don't think so. I don't think if you can prove to me that a kingdom would be a good way of keeping the country together, I won't have any problem with it. But I don't see any reason for it. I don't see any justification for it. I think Reza Pahlavi could come back and live in one of the castles and be a money-making, king in Iran without any authorities. But in reality, thinking that's going to be a salvage, I don't think so. Let me add something to it that may be a little bit, too much. I don't think Reza Pahlavi has any desire to go back to Iran. I don't think he knew. I think he knows that there is no room for him. So the fact that Iran could go back to a constitutional monarchy, my question is why, and how, and who.
Mohammad Amini, I'm so grateful for your time today. Thank you so much for doing this, and thank you for participating in this series. Thank you for your patience, and I know you haven't been feeling so great, so it's an extra gratitude that you.
Thank you very much.
Very well to have you. Merci. Khodafez. That was a conversation with Mohammad Amini, the author and historian whose books include Tradesmanship with History and The Time and Life of Ahmad Kasravi. He joined us from Orange County, California. This is the end of part 3 of our Roqe series, Assessing the Pahlavi Dynasty. Thank you so much for your interest in this series, and we invite you to give us feedback on any of our platforms or via email at info@roqemedia.com. Remember to subscribe on our platforms and become a patron if you appreciate what we do at our website, roqemedia.com. You just have to hit the Support Us button. $5 and $10 a month helps keep the lights on for us at Roqe. Thank you so much. New editions of Roqe are posted across our platforms every Monday and Thursday. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Mizunbashi.